December 2nd, 1993, Medellin, Colombia. Elena Vasquez had been the DEA's best translator for 8 years. That's exactly why they chose her to decode the words that would destroy Pablo Escobar's empire. 200 cartel members filled the warehouse that night. Elena listened through her headset as rival bosses mocked Escobar to his face, called him weak, finished, a relic. Then came Escobar's response. 4 words in perfect English that Elena translated in real time to her handler. I know who's listening. What happened in the next 30 seconds changed everything. The warehouse went silent. Elena's blood turned to ice. And for 30 years, when people talked about Pablo Escobar's downfall, they always came back to this night. The night Escobar looked directly into the hidden camera. The night he spoke Elena's real name. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The static crackled through Elena's headset as her own name, her real name, echoed through the warehouse like a death sentence. 2 floors above the chaos, hidden in the DEA surveillance van, she felt her hands tremble against the translation console. "Control, did you copy that?" Agent Martinez's voice cut through the comm channel, sharp with panic. Elena couldn't respond. Below, through the grainy feed from the hidden cameras, she watched Pablo Escobar's eyes scan the warehouse rafters with predatory precision. He knew. Somehow, impossibly, he knew exactly where she was. The cartel members who had been laughing moments before now pressed themselves against the walls, their earlier bravado evaporating. Even the rival bosses who traveled from Cali to witness Escobar's humiliation seemed to shrink into the shadows. "Elena Vasquez," Escobar repeated, his voice carrying easily through the dead silence. "Our little bird in the sky. Tell me, Pequeña, how long have you been listening to our conversations?" Agent Martinez grabbed her shoulder. "We're blown. Protocol 7 now." But Elena remained frozen, watching the monitors. This wasn't possible. The operation had been compartmentalized, classified beyond top secret. Only 5 people knew her real identity, and 3 of them were in this van. On screen, Escobar pulled a photograph from his jacket pocket and held it up to the camera. Elena's breath caught. It was her DEA identification photo, but written across it in red ink were her mother's maiden name, her childhood address in El Paso, and the name of her niece's elementary school. "We have a mutual friend, Elena," Escobar continued, his tone conversational despite the thunder in his eyes. "Someone who's been very helpful. Someone who told me all about the pretty translator who promised to protect Maria Santos." The blood drained from Elena's face. Maria Santos, her informant, the young mother who'd been feeding them intelligence about cartel money laundering operations, the woman Elena had personally guaranteed would be relocated safely with her daughter once this operation concluded. "Sir, we need to move," the van driver hissed. "Every minute we stay here—" "Wait," Elena's voice cracked. Through her headset she could hear movement in the warehouse. Footsteps. Someone being dragged across concrete. The camera angle shifted as one of Escobar's men adjusted it, and Elena's heart stopped. There, zip-tied to a metal chair in the center of the warehouse, was Maria Santos. The young woman's face was swollen, blood trickling from her nose, but her eyes held a defiance that made Elena's chest tighten. "Maria has something she wants to tell you, Elena," Escobar said, walking behind the chair. "About trust, about loyalty, about what happens to people who betray family." Elena keyed her microphone with shaking fingers. "Maria, if you can hear me—" "She can hear you perfectly," Escobar interrupted. "In fact, she's been hearing everything. Every promise you made, every lie you told, every time you assured her she was safe." His hand rested on Maria's shoulder with false gentleness. "Tell me, what did you promise her daughter? A new life in America? College scholarships? The American dream?" Through the static, Elena heard Maria sob, not from fear, but from something deeper, something that sounded almost like grief. "The interesting thing about family, Elena," Escobar continued, "is that blood always calls to blood. Isn't that right, mija?" Maria lifted her head, and when she spoke, her voice carried clearly through the warehouse audio. "I'm sorry, Papa." The word hit Elena like a physical blow. Papa, father. "You see, Elena," Escobar said, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried perfectly through the deadly quiet warehouse. "You didn't turn my daughter against me. I sent her to you." Agent Martinez was yanking cables from the surveillance equipment, screaming evacuation orders into his radio, but Elena couldn't move. The pieces were falling together with horrible clarity. Maria's detailed knowledge of cartel operations, her reluctance to discuss her family, the way she'd always known exactly which questions the DEA would ask before they asked them. "Everything she told you was real intelligence," Escobar continued. "Everything you've learned about my operations, my roots, my money, all of it true. Because I wanted you to have it. I wanted you to trust her completely." His smile was visible even through the grainy camera feed. "And now, Elena Vasquez, you're going to help me destroy the DEA from the inside." The van lurched into motion, tires screaming against asphalt, but Elena's eyes remained fixed on the monitor. On the screen, Maria Santos, Pablo Escobar's daughter, looked directly into the camera with tears streaming down her face. "Tell them I kept my promise, Elena," she whispered. "Tell them I gave them everything they wanted." The transmission cut to black just as Elena heard the first gunshot. 23 years later, in a small coastal town in Oregon, where Elena Vasquez no longer existed, a package would arrive that would prove Maria Santos had kept another promise entirely, a promise Elena never knew she'd made. The salt air carried the scent of rain as Catherine Walsh, formerly Elena Vasquez, pulled her cardigan tighter and stepped onto the back porch of the lighthouse keeper's cottage she'd called home for over 2 decades. The Oregon coast stretched endlessly before her, gray waves folding into gray sky in a seamless meditation that had once brought her peace. Once, before the nightmares started returning with increasing frequency, before Maria Santos's voice began echoing through her dreams again, whispering promises and apologies in equal measure. The morning routine was sacred, coffee black and bitter, the way her grandmother had taught her, the weather radio crackling with maritime reports, the careful inventory of the horizon, checking for anything that didn't belong. Old habits from a life where survival meant noticing what others missed. "Morning, Miss Walsh." Catherine's hand stilled on her coffee mug. Deputy Tom Brennan stood at the gate, his uniform already damp from the coastal mist. 27 years old, earnest as a golden retriever, and the closest thing to family she'd allowed herself in this carefully constructed life. "You're early today," she said, forcing warmth into her voice. Tom made a point of checking on her twice a week, part of his patrol route through the isolated properties north of Cannon Beach. What he didn't know was that she'd chosen this cottage specifically because it was on his route, because Deputy Brennan reminded her painfully of her nephew David, who would be about the same age now, if he even remembered his Aunt Elena who disappeared one night without explanation, wanted to beat the storm. Tom gestured toward the darkening clouds. "Weather Service is calling for a big one. Might lose power for a few days." He paused, studying her face with the careful concern that made her chest tighten. "You sure you don't want to stay in town? Mrs. Kowalski has that spare room." "I'm fine here, Tom." The words came out sharper than intended. Catherine softened them with a smile that felt rusty from disuse. "I've weathered plenty of storms, more than you'll ever know," she thought. "The kind that leave you washed up on strange shores with nothing but a new name and the weight of the dead." Tom nodded, but his eyes held that familiar worry, the same expression David used to wear when he sensed the adults were hiding something. "Well, if you need anything." He turned to leave, then stopped. "Oh, package came for you yesterday. Martha at the post office asked me to drop it by since I was heading out this way." Catherine's blood turned to ice water. "Package?" "Nothing big. Felt like a book, maybe." Tom pulled a padded envelope from his patrol bag, and Catherine had to force herself not to step backward. Her real name, Elena Vasquez, hadn't been spoken aloud in 23 years, but it might as well have been branded, on the package's surface, for how exposed she suddenly felt. The return address was blank, the postmark too smudged to read clearly. Her hands remained steady as she accepted it, muscle memory from years of training, but inside every alarm bell was screaming. "Thanks, Tom." The words felt like they came from underwater. "Drive safe." He touched the brim of his hat and walked back toward his patrol car, whistling something that sounded like an old country song. Catherine waited until his taillights disappeared around the bend before allowing herself to look down at the package. Her cover name was typed on a plain white label, Catherine Walsh, 1247 Lighthouse Road, Cannon Beach, or. But underneath, in pencil so faint she almost missed it, someone had written a single word in Spanish, promesa, promise. The coffee mug slipped from her fingers, ceramic shattering against the porch boards like gunfire. Like the sound she'd heard through the surveillance feed 23 years ago, the last sound Maria Santos had made before the transmission cut to black. Catherine's knees buckled, and she found herself sitting hard on the porch steps, the package trembling in her hands. Around her, the lighthouse cottage felt suddenly fragile, this sanctuary she'd built from silence and routine, and the careful forgetting of Elena Vasquez. The garden where she grew tomatoes and herbs whose names she murmured in English, never Spanish. The mailbox with a name that belonged to a woman who existed only in DMV records and utility bills. The life where no one asked about her past because everyone assumed she was just another burned-out city transplant seeking peace on the Oregon coast. Peace. As if such a thing were possible when Maria Santos's blood was still on her hands. The first drops of rain began to fall, cold and sharp against her skin. In the distance, thunder rolled across the Pacific like artillery fire. Catherine clutched the package to her chest and tried to remember how to breathe. Inside the cottage, the weather radio crackled with warnings about the approaching storm. But Catherine knew the real storm had already arrived, postmarked and hand-delivered by a past that had finally found her. After 23 years, Maria Santos was keeping another promise. The rain fell harder now, each drop striking the porch like bullets from the past. Catherine's fingers traced the penciled word, promesa, as if touching it might make it disappear. But the letters remained, faint but undeniable, written in the same careful script she remembered from intelligence reports that had crossed her desk in another lifetime. She should burn it, walk straight to the fireplace, throw the package into the flames, and watch 23 years of careful anonymity rise as smoke. That's what Elena Vasquez would have done, the woman who'd survived cartel vendettas and government betrayals by trusting no one and keeping nothing. But Catherine Walsh had grown soft. Catherine Walsh had allowed herself to care about Deputy Tom's morning visits and Mrs. Kowalski's blueberry muffins, and the way the lighthouse beam swept across her bedroom ceiling each night like a blessing. Catherine Walsh was about to get them all killed. Thunder crashed overhead as she stood and walked into the cottage, her bare feet leaving wet prints on the hardwood floors. The package felt heavier with each step, as if it were pulling her back toward gravity she'd spent decades escaping. In the living room, the weather radio continued its litany of warnings. Sustained winds, flooding, power outages, seek shelter immediately. She sat in the worn leather chair she'd bought at an estate sale 15 years ago, her first real purchase as Catherine Walsh, the first thing that felt like it belonged to this new life rather than the old one. Her hands shook as she examined the envelope more closely. The postmark was deliberately obscured, but she could make out partial letters MEA, Miami. Of course it would be Miami, where the DEA's Southern District had housed the Joint Task Force, where Agent Martinez had disappeared 6 months after the warehouse incident, officially transferred but really just gone, where 3 other team members had died in what the official reports called unrelated incidents over the following 2 years. The envelope's seal had been broken and reglued, professionally, but she knew what to look for. Someone had opened this, examined the contents, then sent it along its way like a guided missile with her name written on the warhead. Inside was an old cassette tape, the kind used for surveillance recordings in the 1990s. The label was typewritten, Warehouse 7, October 15th, operational transcript, classified. Below that, in the same pencil script, listen to your voice, Elena. Really listen. Her hands went numb. That tape shouldn't exist. Protocol demanded all surveillance recordings be destroyed within 72 hours of a blown operation. She'd watched Agent Martinez personally feed the originals into the shredder before they'd scattered to safe houses across 3 states. But here it was, the last conversation between Elena Vasquez and Maria Santos. The moment when everything she thought she understood about trust and betrayal and the price of justice had shattered like ceramic against unforgiving ground. A piece of paper fell from the envelope as she lifted out the tape. Notebook paper, torn carefully from a spiral binding. The handwriting was different now, hasty, urgent, nothing like the deliberate script of the address label. Elena, you were right to run. Martinez wasn't the only one feeding them information. The corruption goes higher than we imagined. Maria's death wasn't about punishment, it was about silencing her. She found out something that night, something that would have destroyed careers, lives, entire networks. Listen to the tape, not just to what she says, but how she says it. You were so focused on translating Escobar's words that you missed hers. She was trying to tell you something in that final conversation. A message hidden in plain sight. They think the secret died with her, but she was cleverer than any of us realized. She left you a map, Elena, hidden in words only you would understand. Trust no one in law enforcement. They've been looking for you for 23 years, and not to protect you. Find the truth. It's the only thing that can save us now. A friend. Catherine's vision blurred. The cottage walls seemed to press inward, the careful sanctuary of her new life collapsing like a house of cards. Outside, the storm was reaching its full fury, wind howling through the eaves like the voices of the dead. She walked to the kitchen and pulled out the old boombox she used for listening to audiobooks during the long winter nights. Her fingers trembled as she inserted the cassette, the mechanical click echoing like a gunshot in the sudden silence. For a moment she hesitated. Once she pressed play, Catherine Walsh would cease to exist. There would be only Elena Vasquez again, the woman who'd failed to save Maria Santos, who'd spent 23 years running from a truth she'd been too blind to see, the woman who might finally have a chance to make it right. Lightning illuminated the cottage windows as she pressed play. Through the speakers came the crackle of static, then the distant sound of voices speaking Spanish in a warehouse that no longer existed. And then, clear as yesterday, she heard her own voice beginning to translate the words that had changed everything. The past had found her at last. The speakers crackled with the ghost of her own voice, younger and more confident, translating rapid Spanish into clipped English for the surveillance team. Catherine, Elena, gripped the boombox as if it might anchor her to the present, but the undertow of memory was too strong. Subject approaching the podium, her recorded voice reported. Escobar he's angry, more than angry. Someone challenged his authority in front of the entire council. She jabbed the stop button so hard the cassette player skipped across the kitchen counter. The sudden silence felt like a held breath. Outside, the storm rattled the windows with increasing violence, but inside, the only sound was her ragged breathing. This was insane. Whatever message Maria had supposedly left, whatever conspiracy the anonymous letter claimed to expose, it wasn't worth destroying the life she'd built. Catherine Walsh had friends here, a routine, safety. She taught Spanish to local high school students twice a week, volunteered at the animal shelter, attended the Methodist Church's monthly potluck dinners where nobody asked uncomfortable questions about her past. She could throw the tape away, burn the letter, tell Tom that she'd decided to ride out the storm in town after all, pack a bag, and never come back to the lighthouse cottage. Start over again in another small town with another careful identity. The rational part of her mind, the part that had kept Elena Vasquez alive for 30 years in a business that devoured idealists, cataloged escape routes with automatic efficiency. The bus to Portland left twice daily. From there, she could catch a Greyhound East or a plane south. She had $47,000 in cash hidden in a safety deposit box under the name Sarah Martinez, along with a clean passport and social security card. But as she reached for the cassette, preparing to pull the tape from its housing and destroy the evidence, the boombox crackled back to life. Static, then her own voice again. Wait, something's wrong. The woman they brought in, Maria Santos, she's trying to tell me something. Catherine's hand froze. She didn't remember that part. The official debriefing had focused on Escobar's revelation, on the blown operation and the need for immediate extraction. No one had asked about Maria's final words beyond confirming that the asset had been compromised and executed. She keeps looking at the camera. Elena's voice continued through the speakers. Not at Escobar, at us, at me. She's mouthing something. The tape dissolved into static for several seconds, then cleared. When it resumed, the audio quality was different, enhanced, cleaned up by someone with access to professional equipment. Maria's voice emerged from the background noise, faint but audible. Cuenta las mentiras, Elena. Siempre cuenta las mentiras. Count the lies, Elena. Always count the lies. Catherine sank into the kitchen chair, her legs suddenly unreliable. She'd never heard those words before. The original surveillance feed had been too degraded, the warehouse acoustics too poor. But someone had isolated Maria's voice, amplified it, made it clear enough to understand. Someone who wanted her to know that Maria Santos had died trying to send a message. The phone rang. The sound cut through the kitchen like a blade, sharp and unexpected. Catherine stared at the old rotary phone mounted on the wall beside the refrigerator, a quaint antique that came with the cottage, part of the carefully constructed image of a woman who preferred simpler times. It rang again, then again. She almost didn't answer. In 23 years, she could count on one hand the number of unexpected calls she'd received. Tom occasionally checking about storm preparations, Mrs. Kowalski with questions about Spanish homework for her grandson, the high school principal with scheduling changes. But those calls came during business hours, in cheerful voices that belonged to the ordinary world Catherine Walsh inhabited. This call came in the middle of a storm, while a dead woman's voice echoed from her kitchen speakers. On the fourth ring, she answered. "Catherine?" The voice was wrong, strained, frightened. "It's Tom. Listen to me very carefully. Don't say anything, just listen." Her blood turned to ice. Tom never called her by her first name, always Ms. Walsh with that polite distance she'd carefully maintained. "There are people asking questions about you in town. Federal people. They showed up an hour ago with badges and photos, visiting everyone you know. Mrs. Kowalski, the school, the church. They're saying you're wanted for questioning in connection with an old case." Catherine's grip tightened on the receiver. Through the static-laden connection, she could hear rain and wind, as if Tom was calling from his patrol car. "I'm not supposed to warn you," he continued, his voice barely audible. "But something's not right. These agents, they're asking the wrong questions. About your habits, your schedule, whether you live alone. That's not how you question someone about an old case, Miss Walsh. That's how you plan an extraction." The line went dead. Catherine stared at the silent receiver, then slowly hung up. On the boombox, Maria's voice continued to whisper from beyond the grave, "Count the lies, Elena. Always count the lies." 23 years of lies were about to catch up with her.